This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Have you ever heard politicians and pundits claim that the middle-class living standards have stagnated in the United States? Or have you heard people say that the average American worker lived better in the 1970s? My first guest says these claims are a bunch of bunk. On the second half of the show, we're going to learn about how entrepreneurship thrives in a good environment and leads to the dynamic increases in our standards of living that lets the middle class grow and prosper. My first guest is Dr. Donald Boudreaux. Dr. Boudreaux is the Martha and Nelson Getchell Chair in the Study of Free Market Capitalism. Don't you just love that name? At the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he is also a professor of economics. He's the author of Hypocrites and Halfwits, A Daily Dose of Sanity from Cafe Hayek, where he blogs daily. Don, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Ben.
So, this is a common claim that we hear. The middle class is stagnated in the United States. Why don't you think that this is true?
Well, because if you look at what the middle class can consume out of the income they earn when they work, they can consume a lot more today than they could consume back 30 years ago.
But, you know, you're an economist, I'm an economist, but other economists will say things, you know, Paul Krugman will say, you know, the middle class is stagnated, just look at their wages. I mean, here, we can bring it up here.
You can find data.
Their average hourly wages, adjusted for inflation, go back to early 1970s, a little over $9 an hour. Dips down there in the 90s and is below $8 an hour. Today crawls back up to about $9 an hour. I mean, doesn't this prove their point?
If this statistic were true, if this line were true, it would be in fact the case that ordinary Americans live today no better than in the mid-1970s. But this is highly misleading. It's highly misleading to the point of being untrue.
Okay, well, the numbers aren't wrong, right?
This is a case of lying with statistics, highly misleading statistics.
Okay.
A big problem is adjusting for inflation. Inflation fails to take account of improvements in product quality, improvements in the range of products that consumers have available. And so inflation overstates, or the inflation measures overstate the extent to which inflation has occurred and hence understate the extent to which real wages have in fact grown over the years. And so there's what I do is try to get around the inflation problem by looking at what ordinary Americans can consume out of the wages they earn. And I do that by looking at the prices of things at different times, back in the 70s and today, looking at what the ordinary worker earned back in the 70s and today, and then asking, in each of those two different time periods, how much did an ordinary worker have to work in order to earn enough income to buy the various things that make up a middle-class lifestyle.
So before we start looking at some of those, that you're talking about a middle-class worker, that's not even necessarily representative depending on how many people they're supporting in this, right?
Well, I mean, sometimes the measures, I think this is what you're referring to, sometimes the measures are household incomes, right? So one thing that's happened over the past 35 years is that the number of people living in the typical American household has fallen. It's down by about 11%. That doesn't seem like much, but that means that the same amount of income now is shared, or whatever income a household earns is now shared by fewer people. So each person has a larger slice of each household's pie. By the way, the very fact that each household today has a smaller number of people than it did in the past is a further sign of our increasing wealth, because that means kids can leave home earlier, grandparents don't have to move in with their children as they did in the past as frequently today as they once did.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in thinking about that too, I mean, if you watched an old TV show about people growing up in the 1950s or 60s, the kids are all stacked up in the bedrooms together. There's a boys' room and a girls' room maybe.
That's right, that's right.
Now with the household shrinking, that in itself is a real increase in living standard. I wouldn't want to share a room with my brother.
No, and the typical American home today has more bathrooms than it did back then. So it has fewer people, more bathrooms. So just simple things like not having to share a bathroom with as many people as we did in the past means that we're richer than we were in the past.
So in fact, actually that graph that we just showed, so it's not corrected for inflation correctly because of product quality, but then a 10% change in
number of people in the household.
Number of people, that right there changes the whole story all by itself.
Hugely, yeah. So what I did, and I think you have some, we brought some with us. What I did when I encountered this, I call it the myth of middle class stagnation, is I went on eBay a few years ago, and I bought a fall-winter 1975 Sears catalog. For those of you who don't know, the Sears catalog was basically the Amazon.com of the day. And this was the great retailer to middle America back in the 70s. And so what I did, I said, okay, I know how much the average American worker earned in 1975.
Now, how did you get this, by the way?
Oh, I got it from eBay, right? I paid 99 cents for it on eBay. And by the way, I paid $20 to have it shipped to me overnight. Now, I didn't need it overnight, but I wanted to be able to say honestly that I had it shipped to me overnight, because in 1975, the only people who were having anything shipped to them overnight or shipping anything overnight were people like the President of the United States or Howard Hughes, who was then the richest American. No ordinary American could ship anything or have anything shipped to him or her overnight. I did it for basically 1 hour's wage of an ordinary American. So I got this, and you can go through, you can look at the different products, look at the prices that those products sold for in 1975 dollars. The typical American worker in 1975 earned $4.73 per hour in 1975 dollars. And so you ask a simple question: how many hours did that worker have to work in 1975 to earn enough income to buy the products in this catalog? And let's see what we
take a look at one of them here.
So this is a 10-cup drip coffee maker, no bells and whistles. There's an on and off switch. That 10-cup drip coffee maker was priced at $36.49, which means if you were an ordinary worker in 1975, you had to work almost a whole day to earn enough income to buy that simple coffee maker. Now let's look at a coffee maker today. I couldn't even find a good 10 drip. This is a 12 drip off of Sears.com. It's priced at $16.99. The typical American worker today earns in 2015 dollars $21.07 per hour, which means that to buy that coffee maker today, the typical American worker has to work less than an hour. So from almost a whole day's worth of labor to less than an hour's worth of labor, the typical American can earn enough income to buy a decent coffee maker.
And 2 extra drips.
And 2 extra cups, yeah, 2 extra cups of coffee, yeah. And well, we'll see some others, but this is true throughout everything you find in that catalog. Yeah. So jeans, but by the way, it was very difficult in 1975 to find anything in the catalog that's not made out of petroleum. Almost all the clothing was made out of polyester. Very difficult to find stuff made out of natural fibers. This is one of the few pair of jeans, $6.97, all cotton jeans in 1975. So an hour and a half's worth of work. Jeans today, this is off of Sears.com, $14.99, 43 minutes worth of work. So less than half the amount of time of work required to buy a simple pair of jeans today.
And they're not bell-bottomed.
And they're not bell-bottomed, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Automobile tires. So this is Sears' best automobile tire. More than a day's worth of work to buy an automobile tire. I got a comparable tire today. This is off of Sears.com. 3.3 hours, so less time to buy.
A comparable tire?
Comparable in terms of size and tread wear length, but it's almost certainly a better tire.
You see many fewer people replacing tires on the side of the road today. I imagine they're all more durable.
It's a good point. In fact, it's not really comparable. I meant comparable in the sense of warranty length and size, but
Okay.
it's a much better tire today. This is much less likely to go flat than was one in 1970.
Speaking of much better.
Oh, televisions. So this was Sears' best TV in 1975. Took a month's worth of work if you were an ordinary American worker in 1975 to earn enough income to buy that device. You know what? That device has no remote control. You actually had to get up and physically touch the thing to turn it on, to turn it off, or to choose one of the maybe 4 channels that you could get in 1975.
In my house, the remote control was me back then, because my father would say, boy, go change the station.
That was it. And obviously, it's not high def. The sound quality was much poorer. Look at this compared to a television today. High def, remote control, much better sound quality, less than 2 days worth of work compared to a month's worth of work. This is a much better television than one in 1975. So these are just a few samples of the countless items, almost literally, thousands and thousands of items in Sears catalog. And you go through and you do that same calculation. How much time did the typical worker have to toil in 1975 to earn enough income to buy this product or that product, compared to how much time does the typical American worker today have to toil? And my gosh, in almost all cases, there are very few exceptions, the amount of time required is much, much lower. Not just a little bit lower, a lot lower. And this doesn't account even for the greatly improved quality. I mean, you can see it in TV. Even if the televisions are the same quality, there are a lot less expensive, but the quality is a lot higher.
Yeah, I mean, this is a TV screen behind us. I've been controlling it with a phone.
Yeah.
Try doing that with your 1985 or 1975 telephone.
You couldn't do it. Or in the catalog, ask what is not in the catalog. No digital photography. There were no camcorders. You could buy a movie camera that had film in it that would take motion pictures on film, and you could buy, if you're willing to spend a lot of money, an attached tape recorder that would record sound at the same time. So if you wanted to show sound home movies, you would replay it on the projector, and you'd have to get the tape recorder just right to make sure the sound and the recordings and the film was in sync. You know, the 1970s weren't a poor time. America was a wealthy country, but compared to today, 1975 was a second world country compared to America today.
You know, I think this is actually an important point on second world country, and we've got about a minute or so left here. We've been talking about the middle class, but how about the people in poverty in the United States today compared to the 1970s?
Poor Americans today, and this is borne out in Census Bureau data, poor Americans today, on average, are richer than were ordinary Americans in 1975.
By measures such as?
By measures such as how likely is their household to have 2 or more automobiles, how likely is their household to have a color TV, to have a kitchen range, to have indoor plumbing and artificial lighting. Poor Americans today, the poor American household is more likely to have these basic amenities than was the typical American household 35 years ago, 40 years ago.
So when we look past these raw statistics, what we see is the rich might have got richer, but the middle class have got richer, and even the poor have got richer than the middle class.
The rich have gotten richer. In my view, if you look at consumption, the poor and middle class have gotten even richer. And the relative increase in the living standards has been greater for the poor and middle class Americans than it has been for rich Americans.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today and discussing all of this, Don.
My pleasure.
So our living standards have improved, but this doesn't happen automatically. It takes entrepreneurs. Our next guest will discuss what policies foster productive entrepreneurship and what government policies destroy it. We'll be right back.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Russell Sobel. Dr. Sobel is a professor of economics and entrepreneurship at the Citadel, and he's done a lot of studies on entrepreneurship and public policies throughout the United States and the world. Welcome to the show, Russ.
Well, thanks for having me here today, Ben.
So we just heard on the first half of the episode about how the middle class has been increasing their standards of living here in the United States, and it's a myth that they've stagnated. The question is how? Is it because we have so many bright entrepreneurs of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates here in the United States compared to other places?
Well, entrepreneurs every day keep trying new combinations of resources, just experimenting around, and some of them don't work, but others do. And every time they stumble on something new, it improves our quality of life by giving us something better, faster, even more creative than we had in the past. Even if you take simple things like video games. If you were to go back to, say, the 1970s, we'd be playing a game that had little blips on it, a Pong game that maybe played tennis. Today you can get Madden football that has the reflections of the teams on the stadium on their helmets, and the weather at the stadium that day. It's not just things like video games. If we look at calculators in the 1970s, would have cost a lot of money, and today they're very cheap. But more importantly, life expectancy in the U.S. has gone up by 30 years, at least, over the last 100 years. And that's because of all the innovations in medical technology. It's these improvements that really increase our standard of living through time. And that's what entrepreneurs do.
So we're just lucky that we have more entrepreneurs here in the United States or in Texas? Or does every place have entrepreneurs?
Yeah, the big myth is that there's these places that are rich and there's these places that are poor. And the reason that the places are rich and other places are poor is because some places have entrepreneurs and other places don't. Some people would argue, West Virginia or Zimbabwe is poor because they don't have a lot of good entrepreneurs, because all the good entrepreneurs come to places like Texas. But when we look around, that just doesn't fit the data. There's about the same amount of entrepreneurial people everywhere. The difference across states and across countries is how those entrepreneurial people choose to spend their time and talents.
Yeah, I mean, this makes sense. I've been in Africa before and had people with things that they've made in their home business sticking it in the bus window trying to get me to buy it. So I guess they don't have a shortage of entrepreneurs. It's just those same people probably can't employ other people and invest in capital equipment and stuff. So what is it that helps to explain the difference then of why some entrepreneurs can create more value than others?
Yeah, well, all of us in our lives are searching for a way to provide for our families, to make our lives better off. And when we do that, we select among possible jobs that we could have. A college student, for example, would maybe choose majors based on which major is going to get me a good job, and other people are getting jobs in the area and pays well. And so what happens is that when you're an entrepreneurial person, you have a choice. You can start a business, go into market entrepreneurship, but there's lots of other things you can do with your time and talents. For example, you could go into politics and become a political entrepreneur.
Oh, no.
Well, a good example of that is, I don't know if your viewers are familiar with gerrymandering. Elbridge Gerry is the politician who invented this. Everybody had thought, well, our congressional districts are just these nice squares and that's the way things are. Elbridge Gerry was the first one to realize that there was no really rule that they had to be contiguous like that. And what you could do is throw people out of your district and actually, have this very, snake-shaped district that went along roads to go pick up these people who would vote for you, throw these people out of your district. And so by innovating in politics, he was able to increase his chances of being reelected and making himself better off. That's political entrepreneurship.
That entrepreneurship might have made him better off, but I don't feel like it made me any better off.
And that's exactly the point we need to talk about. Another good example is legal entrepreneurship. I mean, you can go into law and find new ways to sue people. There's a famous case from West Virginia where a lawyer was able to find a way to sue a company and give these checks to everybody who lived right around the company for medical monitoring, because they may come down with some disease in the future, even though nobody had been harmed around the factory. And everybody got these checks for like $20,000 in the mail who lived around that factory. Well, when he won that case, of course, all the other factories ended up getting sued. He was a legal entrepreneur, and other people followed in his footsteps. But here's the big difference, is that
Now,
people who do...
He made a profit on that.
Right.
But what happened to all the factories?
Yes, this is the big difference, right? In all of those cases, it profits the individual. The difference is, what does it do for the society? And in market entrepreneurship, those entrepreneurs are creating wealth, making all of us better off. But when they go into political entrepreneurship, legal entrepreneurship, those are unproductive types of entrepreneurship. They don't make society better off. In fact, in a lot of cases, make society worse off, because we're just fighting over transferring wealth among people and spending resources to do it. And so societies where entrepreneurs spend their time and talents stealing wealth from others rather than creating wealth for others, the societies go backwards.
So in terms of the analogy of the pie, your legal and political entrepreneurs are slicing up the pie differently so they get to eat more of it and someone eats less, but your Steve Jobs or Bill Gates is innovating and growing the pie, and that's how they got wealthier, and we do too, right?
That's right.
So what determines why some countries have more of these productive entrepreneurs that enrich our lives and others have more of these stealers?
Well, like I said, people tend to choose which path to pursue based on how lucrative and rewarding it is for them personally. So if you live in a country that has good free market institutions, classical liberal institutions that reward productive effort, where taxes are low, regulations are easy, and the government is constrained so you can't transfer wealth through the political process, well, then the returns to market entrepreneurship are high, and the returns to trying to lobby and steal from others through the political process is low. But when you have weak rules, bad rules, low economic freedom, well, government's involved in a lot of things, regulating, transferring wealth, and there's these high taxes and high regulations that lower the return to productive entrepreneurship. So in those societies, as an individual, you're better off going into law and politics than you are going into the marketplace.
So it's just price signals are different based on the institutional quality of the country. And in places that are more market oriented, you can make more bucks going in the private sector, but sometimes you're better off going into the government sector.
That's right.
So I know everybody's interested in entrepreneurship in the United States, and they want this productive entrepreneurship that gets growth, and the state governments say this too. What are some examples of policies that states or cities do to try to promote entrepreneurship that end up backfiring?
No, there's a lot of good examples. Let me just tell you one. One of the things that we study is how different policies affect this kind of allocation of entrepreneurship. And one of my favorite examples is about whether taxes should be broad-based or selective. You know, a lot of states want to try to create new economic growth and entrepreneurship by giving away all these selective incentives and subsidies for this company to move here or whatever. And they play all these games with favoring some and not favoring others. West Virginia has a great example. There's about 4 or 5 pages of exemptions from their state sales tax, individual exemptions. One of them is for Girl Scout cookies. You know how that got there, Ben?
Girl Scout cookies?
Girl Scout cookies are exempt from
Well, who
the
doesn't
state
like the
sales
Girl
tax.
Scouts?
Well, yeah, but let me explain how it got there. The Girl Scouts from the whole state spent 3 days in the state capitol lobbying to get that exemption. And they did like all good lobbyists do. They wore their little uniforms, gave away free cookies to all the legislators. And I don't blame them. I couldn't have said no to the Girl Scouts either. But here's the problem, Ben, is that when the Boy Scouts came to my house when I lived there selling wreaths at Christmas, I had to pay sales tax because they don't have a sales tax exemption. And that's very unfair. And I was given this example at a speech in West Virginia. Afterwards, the head of the West Virginia Boy Scouts comes up to me and he says, "Don't worry, we're planning to have Boy Scout days at the legislature next year to get our exemption." So the point is that when governments give away all these goodies, what it does is it draws people's time and talents away from productive activities towards lobbying. Those Girl Scouts could have been learning how to build campfires, helping old ladies, go across the street.
Or selling me cookies.
Or selling cookies. That's how they create wealth, right? But instead, their time and talents were directed at the political process rather than towards the market process. And the problem is when you start doing it on a case-by-case basis, not only do you draw the Girl Scouts in, but then all the other ones have to lobby too. The better thing, Ben, is to have broad-based policies. That is, create an exemption for all youth nonprofits at once.
So, I had a discussion recently with the state legislator here in Texas about this, and generally appreciative of the private enterprise system. And this is, but sometimes the deals just come to us, and we realize that we give this company a special exemption to locate in the state, and they're going to generate more sales tax revenue for us as a result of this. So we still come out ahead. He's like, how on free market principles do I speak against that when it's a good deal for our budget? What would you say?
No, well, the problem with that philosophy is that what it ignores is all the time and effort that now gets directed towards the political process in terms of lobbying. You're not only favoring this company, which could disadvantage other companies. For example, there's a pretty famous case where, in South Carolina, where I'm at, where we subsidized this company to come here, give them all the tax incentives, right? And they end up hiring labor away from all the other firms around them, driving up their cost. A bunch of them went out of business because they couldn't afford to keep their workers. People who were competing with that firm, they go out of business. There's all that, but then what you also end up doing is having all these other people say, wait a minute, now I need to go lobby to get my break. And again, you've got politically connected big companies getting those breaks, but the average mom and pop entrepreneur doesn't. And it's the average mom and pop entrepreneur that was the big difference in America 20 years ago from today. Today we have, all these regulations and permits necessary to open a business. There's even, children's lemonade stands getting shut down these days. In the old days, you used to be able to have bake sales, make something at home and just sell it. Today, that's extremely difficult, and that's stifling this entrepreneurial experimentation process.
Yeah, I think that first part of the answer you gave about the Texas state legislator, I think is an important one because it's the unseen here.
Yeah.
They can see, well, it's a good tax deal for us, so we come out ahead and we get a company. Well, really, you hurt other companies because any policy in favor of one necessarily is a policy against the others. And you got to take account that everyone else is going to come asking for stuff, and that's time that they're not being productive.
Well, you're a professor, right? Think about it. If every time a student came to your office at the end of the semester begging for you to increase their grade for no reason other than you can do it, if you started doing that, what would happen? You'd have a line of students outside your office door because you can give away individual favors.
And that's all time that they're not studying.
That's right.
That they should have been.
That's right.
And I think this is another good point to maybe wrap up with then, if you have in the last minute. If you want to promote economic development and productive entrepreneurship that can, lift the middle class the way we heard about in the first half of the show, what are the policies that states and countries should do?
Make it easy for people to roll the dice and experiment. We've got to remove some of these barriers that keep somebody who's just graduated college from being able to open a business or do it easily. To navigate the process of permits and all these regulations is almost impossible for a first-time entrepreneur these days. We erect too many hurdles that make it very hard for people to go into entrepreneurship. And number two is we've got to quit thinking that the way to promote private entrepreneurship is to grow government. There's too many entrepreneurship centers around the country that think that the way we should promote entrepreneurship is by creating government-managed venture funds and government czars of entrepreneurship education. Those grow the public sector and shrink the private sector, not the other way around.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining us today, Russ.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Well, on today's show, we learned that middle-class stagnation is a myth. Compared to the 1970s or the 1980s, the average person in the United States today is living much better than they were back then. Even people classified as poor in the United States today live better than the average person did in the 1970s. That process doesn't happen automatically. It takes productive entrepreneurs to innovate new products and lower the cost of those products for us. This requires a profit and loss system that sends them the right signals of which products to innovate and which ones not to pursue. When governments get bigger and more intrusive and regulate our lives, it distorts those signals for entrepreneurs and sends them in the wrong direction or prevents them from ever working in the first place. That's what the free market allows us to do, is grow as a society by sending these guys the right signal. We'll see you next time.